It was just another ordinary night. I 27 me and wrapped up work, grabbed some takeout and was sinking into my couch with a true crime documentary playing in the background. The glow of the TV flickered against the walls of my apartment, casting shadows as I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone. It was late, around 11 p.m., too late for visitors. Then, the doorbell rang. I froze. No one ever came by unannounced, especially not this late. My mind immediately went to the usual possibilities. Maybe a package delivery gone wrong, or a neighbor needing something. But when I checked the peephole, there was a woman standing there. She looked exhausted, disheveled. Her hair was messy, her clothes worn out, and yet something about her face made my stomach turn. I opened the door. The moment my eyes met hers, I felt like I had been punched in the chest. She was familiar, too familiar. She barely gave me a second to react before she spoke. It's me. It's Lily. Lily. The name hit me like a truck. It couldn't be. My sister, my little sister, had been dead for nearly a decade. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. My mouth opened, but no words came out. She was watching me, waiting for a response. Her eyes were pleading, desperate. I don't understand. I finally managed to get out. This isn't possible. But she didn't waver. I can prove it. I shook my head. My heart was racing. This had to be a mistake. A sick joke. Lily had died when she was 15. At least, that's what our parents told me. She had run away from home, they said, got into some trouble, and later died in an accident. There was never a funeral, but they insisted it was too painful to go into details, and I believed them. Yet here she was, standing in front of me, alive. I did what any rational person would do. I slammed the door. My hands were shaking. My mind was screaming at me that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But before I could gather my thoughts, there was another knock. Softer this time. Please, she said. Just let me show you. I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to ignore it, to walk away, to pretend this never happened. But something inside me wouldn't let me. Slowly, I opened the door again. She was holding something in her hands, a small tattered photo. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I knew that photo. I had an identical one tucked away in my nightstand. It was the two of us as kids. Lily was maybe 6, me around 9. We were sitting in our old backyard, grinning at the camera with ice cream smeared on our faces. It wasn't a picture anyone else would have. My legs felt weak. I stared at the image, then back at her. It was her. I stepped aside, letting her in. She was shivering. Whether from the cold or nerves, I couldn't tell. She looked around my apartment, like she was trying to convince herself that this moment was real. I didn't know where to start. My mind was racing with too many questions. She sat down, her hands clenched together. Then finally, she spoke. I didn't die, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They sold me. I felt like my brain short-circuited. She swallowed hard, staring at the floor. Mom and Dad, they didn't tell you the truth. I never ran away. I never got into trouble. They sold me because they were in debt. Deep, dangerous debt. I don't know everything, but I know this. I wasn't their first option. They tried other ways to pay it off, but when that failed, someone offered them a way out. A placement, they called it. A permanent solution. My stomach twisted into knots. I stopped myself. The words felt ridiculous, impossible. And yet the details she started sharing, the memories, the little things only she could know, everything was lining up in a way that made me sick to my core. She told me how she had been taken, drugged and transported in a locked vehicle to a house in another state. At first, she was moved between different locations, each time forced into silence. It took years before she met someone who helped her escape, a former victim who had found a way out. Together, they managed to break free. But even after getting away, Lily didn't go to the police. She was terrified they wouldn't believe her. Or worse, that her captors would track her down. It took her months to gather the courage to find me. The years she spent trapped, the way she had to fight to get out, how she finally escaped. And then, the worst part, why she came to me. She had no one else. She had spent months trying to track me down. Our parents, the people who should have fought for her, had erased her like she never existed. Everything inside me was screaming that this couldn't be real, that there had to be another explanation. But the look in her eyes, the raw pain, the desperation, it wasn't something you could fake. A war was raging inside me. If what she was saying was true, then everything I knew about my own life was a lie. My childhood, my family, my parents, I needed proof. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We'll figure this out, I told her, though. I wasn't sure I believed it yet. But first, I need to know everything. She nodded, gripping the photo like it was her last lifeline, and just like that, the world I thought I knew shattered. I barely slept that night. Lily had crashed on my couch, exhausted beyond words, but my mind wouldn't shut off. The more I thought about it, the less anything made sense. If she was telling the truth, and deep down, I already knew she was, then my whole life had been built on a lie. I barely slept that night. I kept telling myself this wasn't real, that there had to be another explanation. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the doubts crept in. By morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for them. I started with the simplest thing I could check. Lily's death. It was the first thing our parents told me when she disappeared, that she had run away, that she had gotten into trouble, that she had died in an accident. But when I searched for any record of her death, nothing came up. No obituary, no police reports, no news articles. I dug deeper, looking for any kind of death certificate or legal documentation. Nothing. It was like the story had been made up out of thin air. Then I checked the dates. I had always believed Lily died when she was 15, but the more I thought about it, the fuzzier the details became. I had never seen any real evidence, just my parents' word, and when I tried to remember when they told me, the timeline didn't match up. I had assumed she died the same year she disappeared, but when I went through old family photos, something was off. There was a gap. Before she disappeared, there were photos of her at my birthday, at holidays, at random family gatherings. Then suddenly, nothing. It wasn't just that she was gone, it was like she had been erased. I needed to hear my parents say it. I hesitated before making the call, staring at my phone for way too long before pressing dial. My mom answered almost immediately, like she had been expecting something. Her voice changed the second I mentioned Lily's name. She was caught off guard, stumbling over her words, backtracking. She stuck to the same old story, but there were cracks now, details she mixed up, dates that didn't line up. And when I asked why there was no record of Lily's death anywhere, she shut down. She told me it was too painful to talk about, then hung up. That was all I needed to hear. Lily watched me from the couch, pulling at the hem of the oversized hoodie I had given her. I didn't need to say anything. She already knew what had happened. We had to keep digging. She started telling me more, things she had been too shaken to say the night before. She remembered being taken by someone she recognized, a family friend, though she had never known his name. She thought maybe he was someone our parents knew from church or work, but she wasn't sure. One moment, she had been in our house. The next, she was somewhere else entirely. She had woken up in an unfamiliar home, surrounded by people she didn't know. She wasn't sure how long she was there, only that there were others like her, other kids. The details got worse from there. She skipped over most of it, but I understood enough. I needed to know if our parents had lied to anyone else. I called a few relatives, some aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. Every story was different. One of them had been told Lily was put into foster care after getting into legal trouble. Another thought she had gone to live with distant relatives out of state. Nobody had been given the same explanation. Nobody had ever questioned it. I drove to our old neighborhood, hoping to find someone who might remember something. Most of the neighbors had changed, but one older woman still lived down the street. She remembered Lily. She also remembered the night she disappeared. She had seen men outside our house. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just assumed it was someone visiting my parents. But now, looking back, she realized something had been off. She had seen Lily get into a car. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't a family car, and she hadn't gotten in willingly. I called my dad next. I knew what I was walking into, but I had to hear it for myself. The moment I brought up Lily, he exploded. He didn't stutter like my mom. He attacked. Told me I was digging up things that didn't concern me. That I had no idea what I was talking about. That I needed to stop. It was the way he said it. Not like a grieving father, but like someone who was scared of the truth coming out. I wasn't backing down. I told him everything I had found, how the dates didn't add up, how nobody had the same story, how a neighbor saw Lily that night. He didn't deny it. He just told me to let it go. I hung up. Not long after, I got a call from my aunt. She was whispering like she didn't want someone to hear. She had always wondered about Lily, but she had been told very clearly, never to ask. I checked one last thing, the missing person report. If Lily had run away, our parents would have filed one. Right? Nothing. There had never been a report. Lily had never been missing, because they knew exactly where she was. She broke down when I told her. She had always known they didn't care about finding her, but hearing it confirmed, it crushed her. That was it. I blocked my parents. Every number, every social media account, every way they could reach me. They had taken everything from her, but she wasn't alone anymore. The fallout started almost immediately. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My parents must have realized they were blocked because they started using different numbers. At first, it was my mom leaving voicemails, her voice shaking, saying this was all a misunderstanding, that I was being manipulated, that Lily was dangerous. My dad's messages started with denial. You're confused. Then came the gaslighting. Lily is dangerous. She's manipulating you. And finally the threat. Drop this nonsense before you regret it. The escalation wasn't sudden, it was calculated, a last-ditch effort to control the narrative. That was all he said. 12 seconds long, no explanations, no denials, just a threat. Then, the family group chat exploded. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly had a lot to say. Some of the family refused to believe it, dismissing the evidence as coincidence or misunderstandings. Others became defensive, lashing out, because they couldn't reconcile the truth with their image of our parents. But a few, just a few, started asking real questions. Why were we all told different stories about Lily? Why was there no missing person report? The cracks in the illusion had started to show. Why was I attacking my own parents? Why was I bringing up things that should stay buried? Did I know how much pain I was causing? A few stood up for me, demanding answers from my parents, but they were drowned out in the chaos. Then I got a private message from an uncle I barely knew. I don't know what you think you found, but you need to stop. Some truths are better left buried. I showed it to Lily. She flinched, gripping her sleeve so tight her knuckles turned white. She didn't want me to go to the police. Not yet. If they find out I'm talking, they'll make me disappear for good. But after the third warning note, something changed. The fear was still there, but so was the anger. I've spent too long running. I want them to pay. She was terrified of what would happen if the people who took her realized she was free. If they found out she was talking. I didn't listen. I contacted a private investigator. I didn't tell Lily right away. If she knew, she would try to stop me. She had spent years surviving by staying invisible, and now that she had resurfaced, she was convinced someone was watching, that it was only a matter of time before they came looking for her. The PI worked for weeks, combing through financial records, tracing hidden accounts. He hit dead ends, closed doors, people refusing to talk. But then he found the first crack. A bank transfer with no legitimate explanation. From there, the trail started to unravel. Large sums of money had been deposited into my parents' account around the time Lily disappeared. They weren't normal transactions, random lump sums, some marked as gifts, others under fake businesses that didn't seem to exist. Then I got an email. No sender name, no subject line. You don't know the full story. Be careful. That was it. Lily saw the email over my shoulder and refused to sleep that night. Every creak, every car passing outside, every little noise sent her into full-body tension. She kept looking at the door, her breath shallow, like she was expecting someone to break in at any moment. The next day, my dad showed up at my workplace. I spotted him through the glass doors before he even stepped inside. He looked furious. The second he saw me, he marched straight over, shoving past the receptionist like he owned the place. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched. He got in my face, barely keeping his voice low. He told me I was making a mistake, that I had no idea what I was getting into, that I needed to let it go. I refused. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said no. He lost it. His voice rose, his face twisted in rage, his fists clenched. He accused me of being brainwashed, of destroying our family, of turning against my own blood. My coworkers had stopped what they were doing, all eyes on us. I stepped back and called security. They escorted him out while he shouted over his shoulder, still trying to get the last word in. That night, my mom sent a long text. She told me I was tearing the family apart, that I didn't understand what was really happening, that I was throwing away everything for someone who had been gone for years. She never said Lily's name. Word started spreading. Extended family members who had blindly defended my parents started hearing the details, the inconsistencies, the missing police report, the financial transactions. Some of them reached out privately, wanting to know the truth. Others doubled down, refusing to believe it. Then I got a call from a journalist. They had caught wind of what was happening through one of my more distant relatives and wanted to do a full expose. They were interested in covering the entire story. Lily's disappearance, my parents' lies, everything. Lily overheard the conversation. Her breathing changed. She started shaking, her whole body curling in on itself like she was trying to disappear. She clutched her head, gasping for air, her eyes darting around the room like she was trapped. It took me almost an hour to calm her down. She didn't want her name out there. She didn't want to be found. We decided to wait. Then I noticed the car. It was parked across the street, engine off, lights dimmed. At first I thought it belonged to a neighbor, but then it was there the next night, and the next. Never the same exact spot, but always close. The windows were tinted. No one ever got out, but I could feel it. Someone was watching. The car was back. Same spot, same tinted windows. Engine off. It had been 2 nights in a row now, parked just far enough to avoid suspicion, but close enough that I knew someone inside was watching. The first time, I brushed it off as coincidence. The second time, I kept an eye on it. The third time, I stepped outside. I didn't do anything drastic, just walked out onto the porch, phone in hand, pretending to check my messages. The second I moved toward the street, the engine roared to life. The car pulled away, slow at first, then picking up speed as it turned the corner. Lily had been watching from the window. The next morning, she found something in the mailbox. A small, folded piece of paper. No envelope. No name. Just 3 words scrawled in uneven handwriting. Let it go. She dropped it like it burned. I called the police. The officer arrived within half an hour, but instead of taking immediate action, he asked vague questions and didn't seem concerned. When I pushed, he admitted that without a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. We need more than just a note, he said. Something concrete, something actionable. It felt like they were waiting for something worse to happen before stepping in. No threats, no specific names. Nothing technically illegal, could be a prank. If anything serious happens, give us a call. That was it. Lily barely spoke the rest of the day. She flinched at every sound, double-checked the locks at least 10 times, barely ate. She wasn't just scared, She was convinced the people who had taken her were watching, that they had found her. I called the private investigator. He had been digging into my parents' finances, and what he found made my stomach turn. There was an adoption record with Lily's name on it, except it was fake. The documents had been filed under a different agency, one that didn't legally exist anymore. The names on the paperwork didn't match our family's last name, but the birth date, the middle name, the details. It was her. It looked like my parents had arranged a private adoption, one that left no legal trace once it was finalized. And then there was the money. Large sums had been moved through their accounts around the time Lily disappeared, withdrawals, deposits, transfers to unknown accounts. The pattern wasn't normal. It wasn't something parents would do if they were trying to find a runaway child. It was something people did when they were selling something. I sent my parents a message. I didn't dance around it. I told them I knew about the money. I knew about the fake adoption. I knew what they had done. They didn't deny it. They didn't try to explain. They just responded with 4 words. Stay out of this. That was it. No excuses. No backtracking. Just a warning. Then my cousin called. Not one I was close with, but someone I had known growing up. She was furious. Accused me of stirring up trouble. Said I was digging up things that would destroy the family's reputation. That I was making a mess out of things that should have stayed in the past. I didn't answer. I just hung up. Lily barely got through the night. She had been sitting by the window, wrapped in one of my sweatshirts, when she saw him, a man across the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. She lost it. Full panic attack. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Just curled into the couch, gasping for air like she was drowning. By the time I looked, he was gone. I didn't wait for another warning. I went out the next day and bought a baseball bat. Thought about getting something more serious, but I wasn't ready to cross that line. Not yet. That night, another note appeared. Not in the mailbox this time. This one was stuck to my windshield. You're not ready for the truth. No envelope. No handwriting this time. Just printed text. Lily begged me to leave. She wanted to run. Leave everything behind. Move to another city. Change names. Disappear again. She didn't care about justice. She just wanted to be safe. I refused. We were too deep now. We had to see it through. I promised her we would find out everything, and I promised we would make them pay. The next crack in the story came from an unexpected source. It was my aunt, the one who had always been quiet, the one who never got involved in family drama. She reached out, voice shaking, and admitted something she had never told anyone. She had known, even back then, that something wasn't right about Lily's disappearance. She remembered my parents acting strangely before it happened. Whispered conversations, sudden expenses, meetings with people she didn't recognize. She had asked questions once. My dad had shut her down, told her to mind her own business. After that, she kept quiet. But now she wanted to talk. My aunt hesitated before speaking, her voice unsteady. I always knew something was wrong, but your father told me not to ask questions. He said it was a family decision. When I pressed him, he threatened to cut me off completely. And she looked down. I didn't have the courage to push further. He had already been pulling records on the fake adoption, but now he was looking for something worse. Illegal adoption rings. He explained how these placements worked. Not official adoptions, not legal transfers, just children being handed off for money. It was a business. One that left no trace if done right. The pieces were fitting together. I sent my parents one final message. Tell me the truth, or I go to the police. No response. But an hour later I got a call. Not from them, from a lawyer. He was polite. Too polite. He told me my parents were willing to have a conversation, but only under legal conditions. I called the bluff. I told him they could talk to the police instead. No more games. That night, the car returned. This time it wasn't just parked outside. This time someone knocked on my door. Lily froze. I pulled her away from the entrance. Checked the security camera. A figure in a hoodie stood outside, head tilted toward the lens, like they knew they were being watched. Then they ran. Lily collapsed, sobbing. She kept saying it over and over. Lily's breath hitched as she gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. They found me. She gasped, barely able to get the words out. They found me. I didn't know who they were, but I was done waiting to find out. I started calling every relative I had left, pressing for information. Most of them refused to talk. But one, my uncle, was already drunk when he picked up. And in his rambling, he slipped up. He admitted he had overheard my dad once, years ago, talking about Lily, calling her a business arrangement. I didn't even respond. I hung up and waited for my mom to break first. She did. Hours later, she sent a text. It wasn't what you think. I demanded a meeting. She wouldn't agree to it. Too dangerous, too risky, she said, but I pushed, told her this was her last chance. We met in a parking lot. She was shaking, eyes red like she had been crying for hours. She told me everything. They had placed Lily in a wealthy couple's home. That's what they called it. A placement, not a sale. A placement. Something had gone wrong. The couple, she hesitated before saying their names, hadn't been what they claimed. She didn't know the details, she swore, but she knew enough. Lily had recognized the names immediately. The people my parents had handed her over to. They weren't just some family. They were part of the group that kept her captive. Lily lost it. She grabbed the phone from my hands, screaming at my mother through the line, demanding to know how she could have done this to her own daughter. My mom just cried. The investigator kept digging. He found something worse. A connection between my father and a known trafficker who had been arrested years ago. It was bigger than just Lily. My parents weren't just involved. They could face serious criminal charges. Lily made her decision. No more running. We were going to the police. The case was finally moving. It took multiple visits, multiple officers brushing us off, but eventually, we found a detective who actually listened. Someone who didn't treat Lily like she was making things up. Someone who actually took the evidence seriously. Lily told her story, everything she could say without breaking down completely. The detective asked for proof, something to back up her claims. That's when I handed over the files. The PI had done his job well. The detective flipped through the documents. The fake adoption, the falsified records, the financial transactions. Then came the kicker. A hidden bank account. The investigator had traced it back to my dad. The deposits matched the exact time frame of Lily's disappearance. The withdrawals, large, irregular sums, some wired to unidentified accounts, others cashed out directly. It was too much to ignore. The detective told us they were officially reopening the case under human trafficking suspicions. Then, something unexpected happened. A new witness came forward. A woman, someone I barely remembered, reached out, an old babysitter from when Lily and I were kids. She had seen something the night Lily disappeared. She remembered my dad arguing with a man outside our house. She had assumed it was a normal fight, something about money, but when she heard about what was happening now, she realized what she had actually seen. Meanwhile, my parents went completely silent. They stopped responding in the family group chat, deleted their social media. No calls, no messages. Then I heard something through the investigator. Law enforcement might be planning a raid. They were building their case, tracking bank records, finding inconsistencies, connecting the dots. If things went the way the detective suspected, my parents could be looking at serious charges. That's when the next threat came. A text message from a blocked number. You have no idea what you've started. I showed it to the detective. She didn't react, just told me and Lily to go somewhere safe. We packed our bags and checked into a hotel under a different name. Lily barely spoke. She kept staring at the door like she expected it to be kicked open at any second. She was convinced someone was coming, and she wasn't wrong. A family member flipped. A distant cousin, one who had been defending my parents, finally cracked. He admitted something I hadn't heard before. We did what we had to do for the family. Those were my dad's words. Not we tried to help Lily. Not we made a mistake. We did what we had to do. Then came another shock. One of the men connected to Lily's captors, one of the people who had controlled her life for years, was dead. Suspicious circumstances. No official cause released yet. The detective wasn't surprised. She told me straight. This is bigger than just your parents. Lily wasn't the only one. There were more. This wasn't just a bad family secret anymore. It was a network. The detective was piecing it together. Who was involved? Where the money went? Who else might have been sold? Then she hit Lily with the worst news yet. Some of the people who took her were still out there. Not in prison. Not caught. Free. She barely slept that night. I started thinking about running, going completely off the grid. But Lily refused. She wasn't going to disappear again. Then the PI gave me one last update. A warrant was being prepared. My dad could be arrested soon. That's when my parents made one last move. They sent an email, begging me to stop, saying I was ruining everything, that I didn't understand what I was doing. I ignored it. They deserved whatever was coming. The raid happened at dawn. The private investigator was the first to confirm it. Law enforcement executed a search warrant at my parents' house. Officers went in with bags, pulling out documents, computers, everything that could tie them to what they did. Then came the arrests. My dad was taken into custody on the spot. My mom wasn't officially arrested, but she was detained for questioning. The news spread fast. My phone blew up with messages from family members. Some were confused, asking if it was true. Others were furious, accusing me of tearing the family apart. One of the worst messages came from my aunt. She begged me to drop the charges, telling me I didn't know the whole story, that there were things I didn't understand. I didn't respond. Lily was done staying silent. She refused to let anyone guilt me into backing down. Then the detective called with something big.
Said there might be more victims.
The financial records weren't just about Lily. Multiple transactions, different dates, different amounts. The police found more names. They weren't releasing anything yet, but it was clear Lily wasn't the only one. Then came another hit, the bank records. They seized my dad's financial records. Everything we suspected was true. The payments, the fake businesses, the hidden transactions. It was all there, more than a decade of illegal money flow. And then, the most shocking thing yet, my mother might be cooperating. She wasn't arrested, but her lawyer was already in talks with the prosecution. She wanted a deal. If she testified against my father, she might walk away with a reduced sentence. I didn't know how to process that. Then came the preliminary hearing. I didn't want to go, but I did. My dad was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of him. His face was cold. No emotion, but when he saw me, his eyes locked on mine. Pure hatred. I didn't look away. Then I saw my mother. She looked broken. She wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't even turn her head toward me. But her lawyer spoke for her. She was cooperating, giving the prosecution everything she knew. Some of the family turned on her instantly. They called her a traitor, a liar, said she was only protecting herself. The courtroom was filled with whispers and tension, people picking sides. Some relatives sat with us. Others sat with my dad. Then the lawyer made his argument. My dad wasn't a trafficker, he claimed. He was just trying to help a troubled child. The defense was laughable, but the legal system is slow. It would take time before justice was fully served. For now, the only thing that mattered was that Lily was finally heard. For the first time in years, people were listening, believing her. She wasn't just a missing person. She wasn't just a forgotten runaway. She was a survivor. For a brief moment, I felt guilt creeping in. No matter what, these were still my parents, and I was part of the reason they were going away forever. Then Lily looked at me. They did this to themselves. She was right, and I was finally free of the guilt. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. The private investigator found something that changed everything. My dad had been connected to a now-defunct adoption agency. At first, it looked like nothing, a company that had shut down years ago. But when the PI dug further, he found its real history. Multiple missing children were linked to it. The pattern was clear. Kids were placed with families, but there were no legal records, no official adoptions. It wasn't an adoption agency. It was a cover for trafficking. After multiple failed attempts to get local law enforcement to take action, I went higher. A contact from the PI connected us with someone at the FBI. They didn't act immediately, but when we presented financial records linking my father to a known trafficker, they launched an investigation. This wasn't just a local crime anymore. This was federal. They took over, combing through every transaction, every deal, every person my dad had been in contact with. Then another crack in the story. A relative flipped. An uncle, one who had always kept his mouth shut, finally admitted something. He had known for years that my dad had strange business dealings. There were late-night meetings, large amounts of money moving around, and conversations that stopped when others entered the room. Nobody questioned it. Until now. The court case intensified. With the FBI involved, my dad was now facing multiple charges: fraud, conspiracy, and possibly human trafficking. Then a journalist reached out. A true crime reporter had heard about the case and wanted to cover Lily's story in depth. Lily wasn't sure. She didn't want exposure, didn't want her face out there. She was afraid that if she went public, the people who took her would come back. Then the next threat arrived. An anonymous email. Stop talking or you'll regret it. No name, no sender. I turned it over to the FBI. They were already expecting threats. Then another bombshell. Investigators found another woman with a similar story to Lily's. She had been placed in a home under suspicious circumstances, just like Lily. This wasn't just my parents. This was bigger. Then came the final blow to the family. My parents' side of the family began distancing themselves. Some refused to believe it. Others were horrified. A few relatives still defended my dad, claiming he was being framed, that it was all a misunderstanding. But most of them stayed quiet. Lily finally started therapy. It wasn't easy. She had spent years hiding her trauma, but for the first time she was trying. Meanwhile, I was barely holding it together. Between court dates, the investigation, and trying to keep Lily safe, it felt like my life had become a constant storm. Then the case made national news. A major outlet picked up the story. It was all over the internet. A wealthy family, secret trafficking ties, a daughter who had escaped. Then my mom reached out. Not through a call, a letter. She begged for forgiveness, said she never wanted this, said she regretted everything. I never opened it. Then the final secret was uncovered. The FBI found a locked safe in my dad's office. Inside were disturbing documents related to adoptions, records of transactions, lists of names. This wasn't just about Lily. My dad had been running a full-scale operation, and he was finally going to pay for it. The trial dragged on for months, but there was never any real question about how it would end. My father tried to negotiate a plea deal. His lawyers claimed he was just a middleman in all of this, that he never hurt anyone, that he was being misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, fake adoptions, multiple victims. The prosecution wasn't interested in deals. The trial moved fast. The jury barely needed time to deliberate. A guilty verdict on all major charges: fraud, conspiracy, human trafficking. My father was sentenced to life in prison. My mother avoided prison, but she wasn't innocent. Her testimony helped put my dad away, but it didn't clear her name. She claimed she was a victim too, that she had no choice. The prosecution agreed to a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, but she lost something far more important: us. She made one last attempt to reach out, a call, sobbing, begging me to remember the good times, to forgive her. I hung up. She was never my mother again. Lily faced our father in court. She took the stand at his sentencing, looked him right in the eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She told him what he had done to her. She told him that she hoped he rotted in prison. He didn't say a word. The family shattered. Some still refused to believe he was guilty, even with the evidence in front of them. They claimed the system was corrupt, that he was framed, that Lily and I had destroyed the family. We didn't care anymore. The nightmare was over. Lily was finally free. We legally changed our last names, cut off every toxic family member. Then we left. We packed up and moved to a new city, a place where no one knew our past, where we could start over. Lily didn't just survive, she thrived. She started working with organizations that help trafficking survivors, speaking to people who had been through what she had, fighting for them in ways no one ever fought for her. She had a purpose now. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. I found closure too. I lost my parents. I lost my childhood, but I gained something more important. My sister, the truth, a real future. Then came the letter from prison, from my father. Neither of us read it. We burned it. Then the documentary came out. A true crime series picked up our story. It went viral. People knew our parents' names, knew what they had done. Other survivors came forward. The world finally saw Lily, not as a victim, but as a fighter. Then came something even bigger. Her first real birthday as a free woman. I threw her a huge celebration. Friends, supporters, people who cared about her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And as I watched her blow out her candles, laughing, safe, free, I knew we had won.